My name's Terry McGovern. I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm currently the chair of the Heilbronn Department of Population and Family Health, and I am also the director of a program called Global Health Justice and Governance. Um, I spent many years as a human rights lawyer. I started out working with women with HIV, and I pretty much learned about intersectionality and racism and pandemics within pandemics as a lawyer in the 80s. I was just a poverty lawyer in New York City and started to see all these women coming in who were HIV positive but never got AIDS. I was seeing women of color, primarily, mostly Black and Latinx women coming in who actually were getting sicker and sicker, losing their kids because they couldn't pay their rent. So their children were being removed because they were seen as non suitable, and ended up understanding that the public health authorities had overlooked this whole issue of converging epidemics. So they had overlooked that women would have different symptoms in the face of being immunocompromised, and they overlooked that communities that lived in houses where there was overcrowding, lack of cleanliness, lots of mold due to the poor services people were receiving. You'd see more bacterial pneumonia, you'd see more tuberculosis, you would see certain diseases that would, of course, be more pronounced and more deadly in the face of immunocompromise. So I sadly was very familiar with the concept of kind of intersectional impacts and a government that really responded to the version of the white male patient. From the very beginning, I was very worried about COVID. I was worried about any kind of statements that young people were not at risk, that just elderly people were at risk, that women weren't at risk, that it was primarily going to hit XYZ group. I knew from my HIV experience that it was going to sadly hit communities that were already burdened by environmental injustice, cardiovascular disease, heart disease. I sadly was not surprised at all when the patterns began to emerge that it was disproportionately killing people of color. Frankly, our public health authorities should have known this. We should know a lot more about how to respond to pandemics. We should know it from HIV. We should know from Ebola. We should know from, particularly, we've learned a lot from epidemics or pandemics that require quarantine. And I just rarely saw, except in the case of a few extraordinary leaders who were really applying an intersectional policy lens, we saw very little usage of lessons learned. The other issue here around women is, 1 in 3 jobs globally, I think, that are deemed essential are held by women. So you have women at risk, then you have women as the primary caregivers in many instances in the home, undervalued, unpaid. In places where children are home from school, women are, triply burdened by having to care for usually, the children. So vast issues around care and a disproportionate impact on women. You have this weird intersection of women being at highest risk as essential workers, and then women being really bearing the burden at home. And there's been a few studies in the academic context of women being much less productive during the quarantine periods, which of course makes total sense, right? Because they're taking care of everybody. But when you think about why aren't we seeing women in leadership positions, or why is most of the public health leadership still male globally? These are the kind of factors that are contributing to this, that women are taking care of people all the time and are vastly affected when there's a quarantine, when there's a health crisis, or The other big piece of this is, which relates to the domestic violence and relates to the caretaking role and how women are sidetracked in an epidemic, is sexual and reproductive health services. So when all the countries started realizing we have to divert resources to COVID, in many places, including the US, lots of folks who really don't believe that women should have access to sexual and reproductive health services seized the opportunity. Policymakers attempted to claim that abortion services, but even sexual and reproductive health services, are not essential. And a lot of clinics that dealt with sexual and reproductive health services or domestic violence were shut down. In the US, we had litigation around the abortion, pretty much successful litigation, but in lots of places around the world, the clinics were just shut and remain shut in some places. This is going to lead to all kinds of disastrous health consequences for some men too, but primarily for women. We saw in Ebola, when women lacked access to essential sexual and reproductive health services, you saw spikes in maternal mortality, in all kinds of sexually transmitted diseases, in even screening around reproductive cancers. On the one hand, we know women are the essential workers and they have to take care of a lot of people. And then on the other hand, we see they're kind of devalued when people are making decisions about what's essential.
My name is Alexis Hoag, and I'm a practitioner in residence at Columbia University within the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. And I came to Columbia after spending over a decade as a criminal defense attorney and also engaged in civil rights litigation. I started my career with the federal government representing individuals who had been sentenced to death and were seeking relief in federal court. And then I transitioned to the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, known as LDF, to advance and protect the rights of Black Americans to bring about a more inclusive society for everyone. At Columbia, it's been a real privilege and an honor to work alongside students, both within the college and the law school. And it's at the law school where I serve primarily as a lecturer in law, teaching courses in abolition of a carceral state, and then in training students in capital post-conviction defense. Today I'll be speaking about policing Black bodies, race, gender, and the criminal legal system. And I use the term criminal legal system rather than criminal justice system because it is not yet just. And I wanted to carve out the particular impact the criminal legal system has on Black people and also on women. And given the systemic racism in this nation, which I argue is a direct holdover from slavery, there is a very particular experience of Black people, of brown people within the criminal legal system because of the racial hierarchy that was instituted during slavery. And you see the remnants of that, the holdover of that in the policies within the criminal legal system today. And then, given the unique experience of women in this country, who also did not have equal rights and citizenship at the country's founding, that still persists today. And so this intersection of race and gender, intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw calls it, results in a disproportionate impact on women, particularly women of color and Black women within the criminal legal system. The way that the criminal legal system operates today, one cannot divorce it from the early experience of the American colonies. So beginning in 1619, when those of African descent were brought to the shores of the American colonies as enslaved people, the early colonial legislatures, the early colonial governors actually instituted laws that designated and distinguished conduct based on race. For example, in some of the early colonies in Louisiana, in Georgia, certain criminal conduct was only considered a crime if a Black enslaved person did it. And so if a Black person were to strike their white master and draw blood, that was an offense that was punishable by death. Whereas if a white person struck a Black person, that was not necessarily a criminal offense. And those early laws, the only means of redress that a Black victim of crime had was that their owner would be reimbursed financially for diminishment of property. or a loss in property. So the very early laws that we had before the country became a nation actually distinguished based on race. Looking at the experience of enslaved women, Black women, crimes against them were not necessarily considered crimes. The rape of a Black woman was not considered a crime. And this you see extended into the 20th century. So the United States has 5% of the world's population, but yet accounts for 30% of the women who are incarcerated across the world. And so the explosion of mass incarceration is really felt with particularity on women in this country. And what's unique about the experience of women who have been incarcerated is that 80% of them are mothers. Over 60% of them have children under the age of 18. And so when you look at this exploding population of women who are incarcerated, it has a devastating effect on families and on young children. And what we know about the impact of incarcerated parents is that it can increase the incarceration rate of children. And it produces adverse childhood experiences, additional trauma for the subsequent generation of children of this massive population of women who we are incarcerating. And then within those demographics, the incarceration rate of women of color is higher than of white women. And so Black women are actually incarcerated at a rate twice as high as white women. And it's not necessarily even in state to state. You have some states such as Oklahoma, which is the highest rate of incarceration of women. What is unique about the women who are incarcerated, particularly women of color, is that they're targeted much more than men and much more than white women in particular for drug crimes and property crimes. That outcome reveals the underlying structural racism that exists in America. People of color are much more likely, particularly in urban settings, to live in hyper-segregated, under-resourced communities that lack access to quality healthcare, that lack access to healthy food, to living wage jobs. So much of crime can be explained, particularly nonviolent crime, can be explained by a lack of access to basic needs.
Everyone, my name is Vibhu Krishna. I'm a third-year medical student at Columbia University in New York City. And during this pandemic, basically medical education got turned upside down. It was put on pause. Clinical rotation kind of dwindled off and became remote, and exam schedules became really iffy. And having studied visual arts in my undergraduate time at Vanderbilt, I wanted to find a way to amplify the voices of the amazing frontline workers, many of whom were my own mentors, many of whom were training me at the time during the rise of the pandemic. And as you probably know, New York City was a major epicenter of everything that was going on at the time. And so I created this platform called Faces of the Frontline, which is a website as well as a digital media campaign living on Instagram that serves to collect and share frontline stories. And the purpose of this is not only to capture what is happening in this extremely historical moment, but also to, in real time, drive awareness to the issues that frontline heroes are facing. And that includes, shortage of PPE, that includes anxiety confronting their working conditions, and it also includes difficulties balancing, increased demands at work, mental health, with increased demands at home as well. I want to start off with a quote by Kimberly Crenshaw from her paper, Mapping the Margins. And she basically says, cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated, but are bound together and influenced by overlapping systems of society. So I'll just leave that here for us to ponder and delve into kind of my own experience. So as a medical student and as a woman of color going through rotations in the hospital, and I think a lot of my female colleagues will commiserate with this, but sometimes you're just not heard. You're just not called on. You're in the room with a patient. Maybe you're even giving guidance to the patient or some sort of counseling or explaining, their discharge summary to them. And if there is a male in the room, the eye contact shifts to the male. And that can also mean, if there's a group of students and the attending physician asks a question, the male voice is more likely to just be picked up on as answering that correctly. Another kind of example that I think a lot of female students and physicians will relate to is kind of automatically being assumed to be involved in a different caretaking role. So, whether you're called a nurse, an assistant, a young lady, sweetheart, any kind of other words, and you know, that's not to say that it is by any means negative to be called a nurse or a PA, but it is just a different role that is being thrust upon you than what it is you are, whether it's a medical student or a practicing physician. That's definitely, a thing that a lot of people experience, and it makes it really challenging when you're trying to give guidance and advice and you hope that it'll be taken seriously and taken back with the patient so that they can continue to follow whatever treatment regimen that they have been prescribed. The physician that we actually featured on Faces of the Frontline, Dr. Sneha Topke, had a similar experience in which she was going for a run in New York City, and someone was not wearing a mask and I think was either sneezing or coughing on the sidewalk. And she wrote a diary entry about how she just kind of stopped and told them politely to wear a mask, and they just started cussing her out. And so, like, and you can say, oh, I'm a doctor, and you can say, like, this is my medical advice. And even if you're not a doctor and you are just, a citizen saying this because it is the guideline and it is the rule in New York City, you're just not always going to be taken seriously. And there will be people who are accustomed to holding the power in these sorts of circumstances who will simply not listen to you just because of how you look and how you sound.